Thank you all for coming out today. We are delighted to have you here at AAJA Society. You heard that I've spent time at AAJA Society for many years, thanks to our friend Rachel Cooper here, who runs the Culture as Diplomacy part of AAJA Society, and she and I are working together. In 2 weeks, we welcome you all back for the JLF USA. That's the US edition of the Jaipur Literary Festival, and we'd love for all of you to come. That's on September 10th here, and September 11th it'll be in 2 other venues at the Center for Fiction and the National Arts Club. There's also an opening reception on the 9th. So please check out jlflitfest.org, jlflitfest.org. I also say that I was born in Tokyo, and my father had no problem picking me out in the window. He said, the brown one is mine. And I have been Pan-Asian ever since. And the role that AAJA Society has played in helping Americans understand Asia and Asians understand America is unparalleled. And I hope all of you will sign up to be members, support the programming, and come again and again to what they're doing here. This program that we're doing at JLF is one small afternoon for AAJA Society because they're doing so many cool things. So please pick up the literature on your way out. We're going to give you plenty of opportunities to ask questions. We agreed that my questions are not going to be as interesting as yours, so we're going to come to you much earlier than in other sessions. And if you don't want to wait, you can DM me either on Twitter @Sree or on Instagram @SreenNet, and I'll be keeping an eye, and we can bring in those questions as needed. Don't tell my wife I offered you to slide into my DMs. That's important. So we're talking about the elections. We're talking about Asian Americans. We're talking about how much America has changed. And what we want this to be is a conversation about Asian America, about the electorate, about politics, but also you have 3 absolute stars of journalism here, a chance for you to look behind the curtain about how journalism works. And because of our AAJA connection here, that makes perfect sense to ask lots of questions about media of these folks who you see them on TV, you see their reporting, but a chance to really dive in and ask questions. I'm going to ask each of them to give us some opening remarks, and then I will grill them, and then you'll have a chance to dive in as well. One of us is a real TV host, the rest of us are not. I play one sometimes, and I'm hoping that Ali gets so out of control that I can say, Ali Velshi, this is my show. So we're hoping for that in a little bit. But we're going to start with Stephanie, and Stephanie is going to lay out some of the polling and where we are at this stage of the race. We have 68 days to go, and that's incredible to think what has happened in the last month or so, and we're going to try to put all of that in perspective. So are you all ready? Yes, and if you're tweeting, sharing, please do. Please tag AAJNY, and please tag all the speakers. They're all on social. Over to you, Stephanie.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys for having me. My name is Stephanie. I actually got my career started by covering Asian American communities in San Gabriel Valley in California. So this is a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. And it's something that we've been following very closely because, I think DNC Chair Jamie Harrison and Representative Judy Chu put it best during the DNC, which is the Asian American electorate has gone from marginalized to the margin of victory, right? This is the fastest growing electorate, likely to be a more diverse group as we move forward into this election and into future cycles. And so it's extremely interesting, and I don't think there's another ethnic bloc that has the same sort of dynamics playing out. We have generational divides, racial divides, even geographical divides. And so this is something that is just so fascinating, and I'm glad that we have more data coming out on this. Just to give a personal plug, Bloomberg News put out a poll just 2 hours ago, I think, that showed that Harris is now in the lead in the 7 battleground states by about 2 percentage points. Now, that's a really close margin, but I think that says a lot about how much this race has changed. In less than 2 months, we've had a presidential candidate almost die during a rally. We've had a somewhat chaotic debate performance that led to Joe Biden dropping out of the race, and now Kamala Harris taking over the reign. And we've had both these conventions. And so all of that to say is that we're all very tired on this panel.
I'll just say that Stephanie and Farnoush did DNC, RNC, and AAJA, the convention in
All of the identities,
yes,
all of our jobs.
Ali
They
did
might be
two of
having a
the three.
nap. They might be having a nap.
We're letting Ali speak for us.
You're right. While I'm talking, they're going to snooze a little.
And there isn't quite a whole lot of data specific to Asian American communities just yet, but I think the most informative one that I've seen is hosted by APIA Votes, which is an organization that's been collecting this data and is just an advocacy group for getting Asian American voters out to vote. And I think most interestingly, between 2020 and 2024, what we've seen is a growth in voter registration for Democrats, but more so independent voters. And so the traditional wisdom holds true that this is one of the most persuadable voter blocs and also one of the most potentially influential. And it's not necessarily just going all Democrat or all Republican. These are very independent-minded thinkers.
So we'll dive into some of those numbers in just a bit, but I'm going to ask Farnoush to give us her perspective. She's been on the road, as you heard, and she's reporting on a daily basis. So thank you for taking a couple of hours off with us. And where do you see things stand right now?
Yeah, no, I think what Stephanie, I mean, it's really hard, right? Most of us do our jobs with the help of polling. It's so hard to determine, and I think I would start this, and I think we all know this, but these are not monoliths. Asian voters are not monoliths, right? Just how Latino voters aren't, Black voters aren't. But I think especially with Asian American voters, we don't know a lot about them, especially as it breaks down Vietnamese, Chinese, Korean. Like, it's really hard to be able to determine what they're going to do, which is why, you know, you see members, whether it's members of Congress who are running for re-election or candidates, or you see Republican or Democratic presidential candidates are trying to see, especially Harris, because of her South Asian, identity, is trying to see how she could maneuver this voting bloc in a way that no previous candidate has done before. And I think it's really interesting. But I think the other thing that, we'll note is that, Kamala Harris did not come to AAJA. Donald Trump, went to NABJ. He is actively trying to engage with that audience. And I think that you'll really see in these next 68 days how much the authentic outreach. Most, in that same data, most AAPI voters said that neither Democrats or Republicans have reached out to them. So we might see an effort by both parties to potentially, risk the support of these groups because they're so focused on Latino voters. They're so focused on Black voters, so focused on college, white educated college women in the suburbs that they can completely forget about this group, and that could be detrimental to both of them.
Yeah, and one of the things that we'd like to see is that outreach being more specific and targeted. That would obviously make a big difference. Ali, your thoughts?
Well, so the complexity of this issue is we often say a given group will say we're not a monolith, and that's always true. But when talking about Asian American Pacific Islanders, there's so few unifying factors other than geography, right? Language is not a unifying factor. Religion is not a unifying factor. As you mentioned, generational stuff is very different. Economic stuff is so. The outreach is really complicated. It's not like you can show up at a given church and you've covered it. One of the things that's interesting about SAJA or Asian American Journalists Association or Asia Society is that in this context, in the West or outside of Asia, Asians feel a kinship to one another. You start subdividing that in any fashion, and they might be on opposite sides of things. So what's the fundamental appeal? In many cases, the fundamental appeal to immigrant groups in general is the party in power when they were brought in. They will have some association to that party, or the party, and this has typically been Democrats in the United States and liberal-ish parties around the world in Western countries that have had a uniquely pro-immigration stance. But once you're a generation removed from immigration as your personal matter, all of a sudden you're like everybody else. You're voting on taxes, you're voting on crime in your neighborhood, you're voting, and Asian Americans are voting on all the other sophisticated issues that people are thinking about, including reproductive rights and things like that. So I struggle with what would successful outreach look like? It's so multi-pronged when it comes to Asians, and yet Asian Americans have some sense of identity with the fact that the Democratic candidate has some Asian American ancestry and connection, and people feel proud of that who have no other connection to Kamala Harris or her Indian mother. So these are fascinating dynamics that make this particular issue complicated. What we have seen, and what you mentioned, is that like Latin Americans, Asian Americans have over time proved to be a little bit complex when it comes to voting patterns. It's not just that every Asian American is making their own decision based on certain things. There are actual there are actual measurable shifts to being a little more conservative as an organization, as a demographic, as the community matures. And that's an interesting concept that does tend to occur with various groups in the United States. So all of this is happening at the same time, and it makes this remarkably interesting to see whether this is a moment for Asian Americans to move forward.
Well, we should definitely dive into immigration as a topic. And I should point out that Ali has a wonderful book called Small Acts of Courage, A Legacy of Endurance in the Fight for Freedom and Fight for Democracy, which has a lot about immigration, but not just single immigration, double immigration, triple immigration. Ali will tell you that he is an actual Kenya-born Muslim, unlike other people who've been accused of that and used as a weapon. He's actually an immigrant and a Kenya-born Muslim.
And that other guy was never at the meeting.
So, Ali, can you talk a little bit about that context and what that means when you are covering immigration and you talk about this on a regular basis on your shows?
Yeah.
What have you learned from the reporting on your book as well as what you're seeing with the election?
Well, the interesting the thing that will apply to this crowd and this discussion is right after COVID, when we saw the attacks on Asian Americans, and which was entirely just racist nonsense, but it stuck, and so it doesn't matter where you are as an Asian American. Once the racists are out for you, or the people have got this impression, it started affecting our families and our parents. And there was the generational divide occurred again because many of these parents, there were elderly Asian Americans who were getting targeted, if you recall. Nobody was attacking a big guy on the street, generally speaking. And parents were inclined to keep their heads low. That is a trait amongst Asian American, particularly Asian American immigrants. Keep your head low, do your work, just excel at what you do. And young people were saying, that's not what we signed up for. We're equal participants in this society. We're not going to do that. And so when you think about where you stand politically, one has to remember that as good as we get, as smart as we get, as much education as we get, as big as our houses are, and as fancy as our cars are, when they decide they don't like you because of the color of your skin, it doesn't matter. That stuff doesn't matter. So you have to remember that. I like everybody else, would like lower taxes, but we are still a nation which struggles with what immigration has meant to this country. Immigration, I'm an economics journalist, immigration has only been good for this country on every level. If you take out immigration from the equation, America's economy will shrink. We are the fastest growing economy in the world. Much of our GDP growth over the next 10 years is attributed directly to immigration. I mean, I'm all about sob stories about treating people poorly at the border, but this is an economic imperative. I'll give you one thing to compare it to. Hungary, which really doesn't like immigrants at all, has offered that if you have 5 children, you will never pay income tax again, because they've got it, like everybody else in the developed world, they've got to get their birth rate up. Nobody's taking the offer because nobody wants 5 children. America needs immigrants. And as far as immigration has gone, Asian American immigration has been very, very, very successful for America. But for those of us who are on that side, where we can't erase our skin or the way we look, we are going to have to remember that when there is an anti-immigrant sentiment, you get lumped into it. Doesn't matter how many generations you've been here. When that stuff was happening, I was interviewing Asian Americans in San Francisco, 7 generations. 7 generations. But you know what? To the racist, it all looks the same.
Thank you. So well said. And again, please get his book and read what he talks about, the three types of immigration from India to Africa, from Africa to Canada, and now you're
2 stops in Africa.
Yeah, 2 stops
And
in
I was the only one who was a single immigrant in my family, but now I'm a double immigrant because I was an immigrant to Canada. So everybody in my family to count, you have to be a double immigrant.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a wonderful story about his family and Mahatma Gandhi that we won't give away here. We want you to buy the book and take a look. Stephanie, if you can come in here, you work for Bloomberg, another great news organization that, of course, focused on economics and business, and you covering the White House, and you've been focused now on the Trump campaign. First of all, what's it like to live and breathe the Trump air for every single day? Talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a very fascinating assignment, I would say, to start. I think I've learned quite a bit about where he's coming from on some of these policies, and also why some of his policies do tend to appeal to Asian American voters. I mean, I think there's a lot of Vietnamese supporters in particular that tend to resonate with his message. And on the topic of immigration, there often are very xenophobic comments. You know, he often says at rallies that most of the people coming from the southern border are Chinese military-age men. Now, there is some statistics that support the fact that there are more Asian Americans coming in through the southern border, but
Asians.
Asians, yes. Asian voters.
And the number one is the people coming from Mexico, and then India
Right.
is number 2.
Right.
So-
But he often uses that to stoke fear in certain communities and to make the argument that immigration is blowing up our economy. It's the reason why we have the deficit. And so, you know, if you take it on the face, there are many folks that would see that and say, like, well, maybe he's got a point. And so I think when it comes to immigration, that has become one of those hot button issues. And I think it's second next to the economy when it comes to topics that voters care most about and what ultimately will drive them to the polls.
And have you been there when he said enemy of the people and pointed all of you out together, the press
All
corps?
the time, yeah, no. So basically every single rally, he'll at some point say, like, look at the fake news back there. They won't turn their cameras on when I'm speaking. And then everyone in the crowd proceeds to turn around and then boo us. And that's just something that happens every single time.
Yeah, and we're just grateful that that's where it ends, and
Right,
it's ended so
right.
far. Because that's a thin line, right, where somebody can then step in and
Very
do
thin
something
line.
else. So we're grateful.
Right.
We're grateful for that. So just in the Vietnamese community, since you mentioned, any Vietnamese Americans here or connected to Vietnam? Tell us about that particular community as an example. They're one of the most of the Asian American communities. We understand that they're one of the most conservative, relatively speaking. Now, you know, I mean, it's a
and I
comparison.
think
So what is?
that has,
Yeah.
that has to do with some historical basis, right? A lot of immigrants from Vietnam came during the fall of Saigon, and so, you know, many of these families in the older generation might be adverse to more communist or socialist ideas, and so when it comes to voting for a progressive agenda versus a conservative, more often than not, they would, you know, associate with the conservative agenda. And so this is a group that has been particularly in support of Trump for the last 8 years? Yeah. But I think what we've seen in some recent polling is that Chinese and Japanese voters are also starting to tend more towards Trump as well, but just by a very small margin. And I think what was actually kind of interesting to note is that Trump went to a Vietnamese restaurant in Virginia.
Very good one.
Just 2 days ago?
Yeah.
Did he eat anything?
I don't think
don't
so.
think he ordered a
I don't
Big
think
Mac?
he
He
did.
just yelled, "I love Vietnam," and
Right.
then left. Yeah.
And I will say, I think that is the only outreach that I've noticed from the Trump
Like
campaign.
an official campaign
right.
event,
I mean,
yeah.
in the way that he's done, you know, 2 events with the Black Conservative Federation, he has surrogates who do a ton of events to pull in Black voters, but that same message hasn't quite come across for Asian American voters. And so they do say that, you know, they have in-language material, that they are doing outreach, but it just isn't as visible as you see, you know, Democrats trying to court Asian voters.
Thank you. Farnoush, talk a little bit about your own time on the trail and what you've been seeing. And you spent time as a political reporter in Ohio.
Yeah.
And Ohio is also changing and is obviously changed. It used to be a bellwether, then it turned red.
Yeah.
But what are you seeing there?
Yeah, I think, I mean, the interesting thing, I mean, so I'm a congressional reporter, so I spend, you know, every day on Capitol Hill, and in the off periods, we get to go out and cover races that are happening across the country. And ironically enough, my parents' representative in Orange County, California, is Young Kim. She's someone who, obviously, Orange County is a huge Vietnamese and Chinese community, especially Southern California, but also Northern California. And then there's Michelle Steele, who is also a Republican Asian American congresswoman who is running for re-election against another Asian American congressman. But, I would tell everybody to go look at that race because it's really interesting the ways that they're trying to turn their Asian American voting bloc constituencies against the other candidate. And it goes back to this like identity politics, right? I mean, I was born in Iran, and in the Middle East, everyone thinks they're the best country in the Middle East, and I know that Asia is the same. Chinese people think they're better than Korean people think they're better than Vietnamese people. So like they're really playing into those stereotypes and not even stereotypes, realities of what it's like to be part of such a large group of people. And they're using that to, to be able to win. And I think it's really interesting that, I think actually presidential candidates could take a note from that about, you can't just broadly campaign towards Asians. You can't just broadly campaign like a Cuban, a Latino in Florida, in Miami-Dade is not the same as a Latino in Houston. You have to these are such different identities. They care about so many different things. They vote so differently. And I think one of the interesting things I've seen is down ballot races, people are really targeting these groups because they know that they're crucial to them. They know that they're growing. And more importantly, I think candidate quality is really important and not talked about enough. I mean, the Asian American voting bloc came out in over 75% for Obama in 2012. And for Biden, it was in the early 70s. And it potentially could be less this time around. So the Democratic candidate or the Republican candidate has to be someone that they see qualities that they're looking for beyond the issues. And I think that a lot of Democrats and Republicans have taken, for granted that the Asian American voting bloc, even though they're 4%, they're going to be there for them no matter what. But we're seeing with the independent candidates, with someone like RFK, who's no longer, obviously, but he's still on the ballot in certain states, that could really be the margin of difference for them in some of these states.
Yeah, and we've seen that there are, we talk a lot about the presidential race, and that's why it's great that you're here talking about the congressional races, that few hundred votes can make a difference in some places, and that'll have an impact. One thing that I want to clarify, I just got a note, was that we're talking about an increase in these communities voting for Trump, but it's still a smaller percentage, right? So you've heard about black turnout, black support for Trump. It went from 6% in 2016 to 8% in 2020. So but if you hear it in the media, you'll think it's 20%.
For sure. But in a state like Georgia, that could be the difference.
Make the difference.
When people are
Exactly.
losing, when Joe Biden only won by 2,000 votes.
Exactly.
That could be the difference.
Exactly. Ali, can you talk a little bit about how you've seen the race change after Biden, now with Harris? What is the change?
Well, it's remarkable because, as Stephanie was saying, particularly the swing state polling that we've just seen, it's all well within the margin of error. But if you watch polling, you learn not to trust all of it, but you do learn to watch trends, right? The trend has been one way and one way only with Kamala Harris. It was, in the beginning, I think it was confusion after Joe Biden left and not sure how this was all going to shake down in the early days. And then it became apparent within days that Kamala Harris would be the candidate. Everybody else who could have challenged her basically bowed out, and some of them decided they wanted to try and be her vice presidential candidate. So she rode this remarkable wave that I have never seen in my life. People say this is like 2008 with Obama. It's entirely different. 2008 with Obama, this might be that it gets exciting like Obama, and it brings people out who otherwise don't vote like Obama. But Obama was not a turnaround story. It was a slow burn story post the convention, or post the getting the nomination. This is a turnaround. I don't know if anybody remembers when Kamala Harris ran for president last time what her numbers were. They were low single digits. One not a delegate was out before the race started. This was not obvious that Kamala Harris was going to be this electrifying force that she is. Some of it is Kamala Harris. She's remarkable. Her performance has changed dramatically. The vice presidency has grown her. Some of it is people who needed some other answer than Joe Biden. And were prepared to get behind kind of almost anyone. And some of it is this remarkable culture that has evolved around her on the internet that has turned everything that was a potential foible or failure or weakness of hers into some kind of a strength, which is kind of amazing. So she has energized people. Here's the bottom line. 81 million people voted for Joe Biden last time, 74 million for Donald Trump. 80 million people who could have voted didn't vote. That's what this comes down to. Kamala Harris doesn't need a whole bunch of, but there are all sorts of Republicans for Harris out there, doesn't need them. There's all sorts of people talking about fundraising, doesn't need it. She got lots of money. She needs Democrats to vote for her, and she needs people who were not otherwise going to vote for her. And generally across the board, we're seeing increases in all of those places. There is one major exception, and it is Arab, Muslim, and Palestinian Americans. That remains to be seen how that's going to pan out. And it's too early to know because lots of things can happen, including a ceasefire deal, including Kamala Harris saying the kinds of things she said at the DNC, and including specific outreach, which has begun. Remains to be seen because there's a complicating factor here, and that is Jill Stein. Don't really know what she does between elections, but she's back. And she has got a Palestinian American running mate. And Jill Stein's not going to win a delegate either, but she did wreck the election for Hillary Clinton. But for a disaffected group of voters, particularly in Michigan, but elsewhere in the country, including in California, it is somewhere to say I'm still participating in the political process by voting for someone. Everybody's got to have a very, very real conversation with everybody about whether this is the election in which you should have a protest vote. I think a protest vote in the primaries was a very interesting, and I always think that sort of thing is very positive, no matter what the issue is. Participating in the process and demonstrating your process, I think, is as patriotic and American as it gets. You have to think about that differently for the election.
Let's talk more about this because there was so much attention paid to the issue of whether the DNC would put a Palestinian American speaker on the main stage. There was a panel, there were other things that happened, but there wasn't they were not given a speaking slot. One of the things, the defense from the DNC was they're called uncommitted. So why would you put somebody on stage if you're called uncommitted? So talk a little bit about that, Ali, and then let's go to Stephanie.
Well, first of all, they're called uncommitted because that's what the vote is. When you vote in the primary in Michigan, that's how you vote. So it's a play on the fact that you showed up for the primary and didn't vote for a candidate on there. So it's some bad branding, and I think there's an argument for that, but they're not actually uncommitted. They are actually Democrats. I interviewed Roa Roman from Georgia, who was one of the people who was possibly going to be the speaker. She delivered the speech she was going to deliver outside, but it's not that effective when you're doing it on an iPhone. But she was actually going to endorse Kamala Harris. Would have been a 2-minute speech in 86 hours of speaking. I would have thought it would have been a good thing to do. That said, here's the argument I've heard. 2 minutes of a Palestinian American speaker who, it's not all that motivating to all viewers, right? This was like a Super Bowl, this thing. It was just concerts and performances and very well produced. Kamala Harris spending 45 seconds on the issue in her speech, which is about 43 seconds more than Joe Biden has spent, may have been more important. So I'm unclear on how this is going to pan out. The bottom line is America is involved in a war in a way that people are pointing out it shouldn't be, particularly because it goes against American law to be financing a humanitarian catastrophe. But Joe Biden's not prepared to go there. And he has been unusual about this because he's a man whose entire life is built on remarkable empathy, but he can't seem to muster that up for Palestinians. Kamala Harris does seem to be mustering it up for Palestinians. What is enough is hard to know. I think the issue is for Muslim and Arab and Palestinian, or Muslim and Arab and Palestinian voters. This is a binary election. It's going to be one or it's going to be the other, and every voter has got to make that choice for themselves about is my protest of one more important than avoiding getting stuck with the other. It's everybody's own question, but they've actually got to think about that one.
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, if you take what Harris said during her DNC speech, she really just said, I stand with Israel in terms of its right to defend itself, but I also empathize with Palestinians. And that's not a lot of context, or there's not much policy associated with that. So I don't think her answer really appeased many young voters. And I tried to ask
That's what I was going to say, that it's also young voters, not
Right.
just.
Yeah, 100% correct that you
Yes.
point that out.
And so I tried to chat with a couple of them during the DNC and also protesters, just see, how are you feeling about this? Did what she say do enough for you? And
Probably nobody said yes, right?
yeah, some folks were like, well, this election is now weighing on me, just how important this is, and perhaps we suspend our protest for just 2 months, get her into office, and then we, continue our fight. And that's sort of the sentiment that I was getting from many folks in the crowd. But again, she really hasn't given much insight into her policy and what she would envision for for her administration. But of course, she's been in the race for a little over a month now, and they're pretty much building the plane as they're flying it. So I think Allie's point is very correct that it's really too soon to say what exactly the impact will be.
But I don't know if it's like a risk they could take. I mean, again, I don't want to be annoying about the margins, but like when you talk about Jill Stein, when you talk about Black voters, when you talk about Arab American voters in Michigan, like there is no victory without Michigan for her, right? For Democrats, they need that blue wall, and I think like 2,000 people protesting it could be a major difference. I also agree that I think she said more than Biden has ever said, but I don't actually think that is even a lot, because she's,
Agreed, yes.
yeah. And
It's
I
limited,
think
yeah.
I think saying that you're, telling us what we are all seeing on our screens is great to hear from a presidential candidate, but I think so many people wanted her to talk about the international law, which is the main crux of the argument, right? Of like how involved the U.S. is. But yeah, I think we all don't know. I did see earlier this morning that the Muslims for Harris decided that they're going to support her over this period of the next 2 months, and then reassess after the election.
Today's an important day. As you know, she's given her first sit-down interview to Dana
So thanks
Bash.
for being here and not watching that.
But you'll see all the clips everywhere. There's already a clip out about her changing her mind on fracking, and she said that it's different when you're running for Attorney General of California or even San Francisco versus.
Which is true.
Yeah, which is, yeah.
It's true. You're running for office in Pennsylvania, you got to have a different take sometimes.
Exactly. And so please get ready with your questions. The other thing I was going to say is that for today, she was in Georgia, and she specifically said to the crowd that, let's bring the hostages home and let's have a ceasefire. She specifically said that in a way she didn't. There was a little bit of a nuance difference, more assertiveness, I think, and she said that we're working on it. So we don't know if that's any.
Right, so if every 3 days it's a little more firm, in 2 weeks we might have something that,
I mean, and what comes down to it is, will there be a ceasefire between now and the election, right? Like, that could change everything.
But we know, if anyone watching, they understand that Netanyahu wants Trump to win, and one of the ways he believes he can have Trump win
Not having a ceasefire.
Not having a ceasefire. So all he has to do is hold out for the 68 days that we're talking about here, because for him, that's who he needs. Another thing just to say, all the talk about polling before we come to your questions, is that remember what the question is when they poll you. What do they ask? If the election were held today, who would you vote for?
Yeah.
And the election is not being held today.
Right.
68 days, there's so much is going to happen, right? You heard Stephanie say, what has happened in the last 2 months? We still have those 2 months left. And so the day that she became the nominee, or when Biden stepped down, to the election day is is more than the election runtime of the campaign runtime of France, UK, and India.
Yes.
So that's how much time there is. And now of course it's less. So there's so much that's going to happen, and you're going to see these folks cover all of it. Let's get some questions in. We have microphones. Please identify yourself. No speeches, please. Questions. And we'll start over there. And John, please pick anybody you like. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Charles. My question is, the election, essentially, from what I understand, essentially comes down to 7 states, and the battle is over the 7 states, and the rest of the stuff is mathematically been pretty much determined. So my question regarding that aspect of it is, how much of the Asian American electorate is involved in those 7 key states? Is it meaningful enough for a politician to have to address that particular community, to try to get those particular 7 states to align with them?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there was a poll out recently that said that they took what the Asian American voting bloc is in each of the 7 battleground states, and that are for in 2024, right? Because it was different in 2020, and they said that the margin of those votes is exactly the margin of victory for those candidates. So yes, it would make the difference. And even though, like, as if you were to look at an Asian American electorate map, you would see obviously Texas and California and New Jersey are like the more highly populated Asian populations. But just because of how close the race is in those 7 states, that if Asian Americans decide one or the other, they could make the differentiation vote in that case.
Two things I'll add to that. I mean, if we look back to the Georgia Senate races, the Asian American vote was largely credited for bringing in 2 Democratic senators. And so this is something that the DNC often highlights when they talk to their AAPI caucus to say, you know, your vote really does matter. And the other thing that I think I saw a Brookings piece maybe a couple of months ago that noted the shift in Asian American demographics, and there's a significant shift in Asian populations in states like North Carolina, Arizona, Nevada. So clearly, you know, the movement into these states.
Nevada is huge. Yeah,
really
I think of all the 7 battleground states, Nevada is one of the largest.
But it's the interesting stuff from polling just in the last 24 hours. We see, as we discussed, the shift in sentiment toward Harris in the battleground states. But if you look at the down ballot races, the shift is substantially greater.
Yeah.
So the idea that North Carolina, for instance, is actually in play.
It's crazy.
But there's no question that there's no question. Josh Stein is probably going to win as governor. He's 8 points ahead of the kook he's running against. So these things make a difference in those kinds of discussions too, because we talk about 7 battleground states, but the map is expanding in this particular moment in the election. Lots of things are possible. So, but it's all on the margins, right? We're not going to see blowouts in a lot of places. We're going to see marginal gains. I remind everybody, Georgia was fewer than 12,000 votes in total. So everybody matters when you're fewer than 12,000 votes for an entire state. So I think it all matters at this point. If anybody you can appeal to where the return on investment is greater than the amount of time you're spending in it. Look, you talked about Harris and Walz being in Georgia. They weren't in Atlanta. They were not in the 10 counties that Democrats always focus on, which always win them the state. They were in Southeast Georgia, where at best one of those visits could net them 1,000 or 2,000 extra votes, but 1,000 or 2,000 extra votes in Georgia could be the presidency.
Yeah, and then, I mean, just to give you the down ballot, like Chuck Schumer is now talking about the Senate, right? The Senate map expanding to Texas and Florida, which is just insane if you think about it. 2 months ago, but just ever for Democrats to be able to be competitive in those states and to win not only a district race, but a statewide race. So they are very jubilant. They're on a honeymoon high. I guess we'll just see how far Harris can take them.
You know, one of the things that we're seeing with all these states is that you have to be very careful when you make generalizations, right?
Correct.
Like that's the hard part, because it's all going to change so quickly, and it's going to matter.
And people don't like to be generalized about.
That's absolutely right. Yeah, go ahead, John has the mic.
Thank you. My name is Karen Bhatia. I teach social entrepreneurship for Stanford, and I used to lead tech strategy at the New York City Economic Development Corporation. My question is about specifically the South Asian demographic, and if you see a particular way in which they're focusing on Gaza, if that's affecting their vote, and if there's a generational or how quickly or how recently they've immigrated, if that's affected them. I worked on South Asian outreach for Tom Swazi when he was running in the special election, and I would constantly get that question from South Asians, and I couldn't figure out patterns around it. And so I was wondering if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, if you think Asian Americans are hard electorate to get data on, South Asian is obviously even more.
Yeah.
But I would say it's all age-wise, right? So like really young South Asian Americans are more active in this election than they have been in previous ones. Some of it's their first time voting. And obviously the issue of Gaza kind of goes beyond geographic religious identity for young folks, who most of them are not religious, are either identify as agnostic or atheist. But even if they are, they tend to click into that part of their religion for the empathy part for the Palestinians. So it is a huge, huge issue for them. I think as far as, they also are, like to go against, we all know if we're immigrants or the children of immigrants, we have to go against our parents and what they're doing. And we tend to not exactly follow in line in a way that I think a white American would fall in line. My dad has voted for Trump. I'm voting for Trump. That's not always the same in immigrant households. So I think it is a huge concern for them.
Yeah,
I was going to ask a follow-up to that. Does Modi's stance, do you think, affects Indian American voters in the U.S. in terms of his stance towards Israel?
It's a good question. There was a real divide about what Modi on anything means to Indian Americans, and amongst a lot of younger ones, there's a real frustration because their parents are kind of Modyists and they are not. In fact, a lot of young professional South Asian Indian Americans are embarrassed by and very proud of India at the moment for having rebuffed a complete wipeout with Modi. But so hard to know. I think if you like Modi, then maybe it has an impact on you. Whenever I do panels around the country where I take 6 people, and in theory 2 of them are Democrats and 2 of them are independents and 2 of them are Republicans, an Indian always makes it into my Republican column. Good, honest, hardworking people who, generally speaking, run a small business and want less regulation and smaller taxes. And it becomes a little awkward for them because when these more complicated questions come up, they're like, well, we're not really, that's not what I'm all about, or that's not what I'm voting on. I just want smaller.
Fiscal conservatives.
They're fiscal conservatives, correct. But the Republican Party has messed that whole thing up because there are good, regular fiscal conservatives who are now associated with all sorts of stuff they don't want to be associated with. So it's a really good question. Probably best to hand that over back to an academic at Stanford because that's more your work than ours.
Let us know.
Yeah, let us know, please.
I will say that if those of you who are following this and you're curious about the South Asian efforts, you may have seen that right after the Black Women for Harris, that was the first one, and then suddenly there was the South Asian Women for Harris. They really led the way for all kinds of other folks doing this. But I would encourage you to look up something called desipresident.com. So Desi is a word that South Asians use for like our own people. And so DESI president, you'll see a lot of stats and polls and because they've been energized by Kamala Harris and her story.
The one thing I'll add about Modi is that, he had a very close relationship with Trump, and that's one of the things that he often touts when it comes to appealing to these voter blocs. And in talking to sources in the national security sphere, a lot of them have said that if Trump is reelected, his main allies in the Indo-Pacific would be Modi and Kishida in Japan.
Good point, yeah.
Good evening. My name is Dr. Andrew White. I'm a professor of communications at St. John's University. First and foremost, I'm thrilled to be here, and I thank you all for your words and your comments and your thoughts and your sensitivity. My wife, Wang Fuchong, who I met in China, and I just finished a study on the discursive exclusion of Chinese Americans in New York political media landscape. And what I found was, on the quantitative side, Asian Americans were not specifically excluded. But on the qualitative side, much of the media landscape and much of the media discussion talked around the Asian American community, but specifically not to them. And the other thing that I found was that even in the context of COVID, when Asian Americans and Chinese Americans were being beaten and killed in the streets, they were never a part of the discussion. They were never a part of the conversation about what was going on, why it was going on. And more specifically, because it was in the context of the mayoral election, I found that the politicians who were running to represent this community, the entire New York community, weren't present. And my question is, on the journalistic side, to what extent is there an expectation, a minimum level of expectation that journalists ask, where are these people? And if they aren't doing that, is that not somewhat contra to their baseline expectation of accuracy and inclusion of as much of the perspective as possible?
Yeah.
Dr. White, can you tell us a little bit about the study, where we can find it? And yeah, go ahead. Can you just leave them the mic? Sorry, can you just give them back the mic? Where have you already published it? Where?
Yes, it's published. It's on ProQuest. I'd be happy to send it to anyone who's interested. And I have recommendations on the way forward. And the other part of the conversation is, especially when we get to our friend's question about quantifying the value of specific groups of people, rather than being very intentional about, finding out what their interests are, it becomes very tenuous, right? And so, I call it affirmative journalism when you ask who and what are missing, both on the represented side and the representative side. If you have a scenario where you have a community meeting to protest the violence against Asian Americans in the streets of New York, and the people that are looking to run the city of New York are not present, are you asking who and what are missing?
Thank you. That's so important. I would also add that on the networks, of course, Ali is an exception. Fareed Zakaria is another exception. Often now, especially now that Kamala Harris is a candidate, you'll see them talking about Asian American voters. You'll hear them talking about the Indian American ancestry of hers, and there won't be a single Asian panelist there.
Yeah.
I will add that the two women who are covering Harris on the major networks, CNN and CBS, are both Asian American women. And they sit in the front row of the briefing room, and it's a great sight to see. But I will say there is a lot.
I'm not saying there aren't any, but I'm saying, like, if you, like I have, you watch
the panels,
three
the
days
panels.
of programming, you'll the prime time evening talking heads, you'll see, because in this country race has been binary, and then they brought in the Hispanic question and how do you address that, and they've done a very good job of that, but they haven't done enough. So not to Ali, but to the rest of the networks and the rest of MSNBC, I would ask them to cover more. And thank you, Dr. White, for your research, and I think that's really important. Thank you. And I'd never heard affirmative journalism before, so that's new. That's new to me. Whoever has the mic, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Koichi Shuriyanagi, and I'm a copy editor and member of AAJA. And my question is, the vice presidential picks. J.D. Vance has an Indian American wife.
Yes.
And so that's interesting. And Tim Walz, was the governor of Minnesota, and there's a Asian population in Minnesota where he's built a relationship with as governor. So I wanted to know, how, you guys didn't mention the vice presidential picks, but, how did they have an impact on Asian American voting in this election?
There's a very famous line that the vice presidential nominees make no difference until they do, right? So that's
Until they become the presidential candidate. Yeah.
Look at what's happening now.
Yeah.
So this is a very good question. Thank you for that.
I mostly just want to come and hug you. You're a copy editor. I haven't had a copy editor in years.
Saving us.
Best thing in the world, copy editor.
editors
So
are great.
I mean, the most underrated and most important people in journalism. So thank you
All
for
right,
what
we'll
you
give
do.
a hand.
Yay, copy editors.
Just for the non-journalists in the room, what has happened in American journalism is a tranche of copy editors, mid-level editors, has just disappeared.
Just disappeared,
and,
literally.
And as a result,
They were the ones who made sure you didn't get fired. You didn't say stuff that was nonsensical, that wasn't wrong.
that's-
So thank you for what you do.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm sorry. I was going to
please.
say, I'll start with J.D. Vance. I think when it came to the pick for Vance, it was largely to target Pennsylvania back when Biden still had, somewhat of a lead in the state. And so his role on this campaign very much is to appeal to the white working class voter. And so when it comes to Asian American voters, I don't think he has much of an influence. But, him as a running mate could significantly boost Trump's ticket should he successfully reach these union workers and appeal to these working class voters with his own personal story.
I think his wife is really interesting, right? Like, she came out for the first time publicly speaking at the RNC, which we all were at. And I think that they have really purposefully not utilized her in an identity politics way, right? Because of the criticism that they constantly give Democrats about using identity politics as a way to gain voters, as a way to move ahead. And I think you have seen, I think one of the more stunning examples of that was right after Trump mentioned at NABJ that Kamala Harris turned black, and he didn't know whether
That was super
when
effective.
she was, He didn't know when she was.
Whether that was
South
news to a
Asian.
lot of Indian American people who were always complaining that she wasn't Indian enough.
Right,
yeah.
correct,
It was
yeah.
like-
So you're never enough for either when you're
Correct.
when you're a mixed identity. But after that, I mean, JD Vance was like with reporters. He had a moment to, he has children who are half mixed, who are white and half Indian, and he had a moment to really make a stance for Republicans on that issue. And he continued it. He said that she's a chameleon, and he continued to push that narrative along. So I think you're seeing, Republican voters also don't really engage in identity politics. So, and that could go both ways. They don't want their candidate engaging in it, or like a lot of Republicans I talked to on the Hill were like, please stop talking about her race. Please stop talking about her gender. Like, talk about the fact that she screwed up the border or whatever else you want to talk about. Talk about policy. Help, like, focusing in on Kamala Harris being Black, South Asian, and a woman is not going to win.
Not a winning strategy.
It's not going to
right.
win the presidential election. Please move on. And obviously, Donald Trump does what he wants to do, so he has not. But I think, the Usha Vance is going to be really interesting in how they utilize her, because so far they have not.
Yeah.
And because I think I go back and look at the sequence, but it happened so quickly. I think Usha Vance came on the scene, but didn't have that much time before it became obvious that that Harris was going to be
Yeah,
there. So it
she
happened
was
so
up-
quickly.
Yeah, she was upended by
The
another South
news
Asian
cycle
woman.
for that was very
Yeah.
short.
Yeah.
And somebody said that when we go back and look at this election, if it goes for Harris, the fact that the DNC just happened to be second will have played a role in people's memories and everything else. If you go back and look at the coverage the day after Trump was shot and where everybody thought the
Yeah,
election
I mean,
was
we were all
going.
there. We thought they were celebrating. They were like, "How much are we going to win?"
Yeah, they were
Not
landslide.
If we win.
Yeah, that was
landslide victory.
That's why 68 days is a long time.
It's a long time.
Let's get more questions. Lots of hands up. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Arindam, and I live in New York City. I'm in the banking industry and been associated with Asia Society for a very long time. So I know you mentioned that we do all say that the Asians are not monolithic; they're different groups. But I think there's one thing which stitches the Asian community together is an abiding belief in education and meritocracy, right? So do you think the way the Democrats have handled the college protests and the fair admissions case over the last couple of years, and the college protest more recently, kind of somewhat of a muddled response, not sure whether they want to go all out, criticize, go all out to support, that leads to a DNC statement by Kamala Harris, what one could say a play of words. In fact, today in Wall Street Journal, there was a scathing article saying it's a Phil Gordon's word saying but versus at the same time I'm in support of Gaza. Do you think there is an impact of that stance, or not a stance, will be on the Asian American voters? And as we're all talking about 40,000 votes across the country, 100,000 votes will make the difference. Do you see there's a risk of that?
And it's interesting you'd ask that just as campuses are coming back online
Exactly, and
and
it was in
protests are going
Cornell
to be,
just last week,
Yeah.
right?
and it's going to be all front and center these
Exactly.
next 68 days. Before I just turn it over to them, just remember that there's one candidate that is come out and said they want to abolish the Department of Education.
Right.
So that's when you have to think about what happens and where they
Yeah,
go.
that's the interesting part about it. Your question's very astute, but here's the problem. Your argument is right. In a vacuum, the Democrats, muddled is a really good word for how they've handled this stuff, right? It's not universally bad, but it's muddled. But the problem is, compared to Republicans, it's stellar. If you have a bell curve, they're getting an A+. And that's the problem, that Republicans have, particularly as it relates to college campuses, Democrats have largely been all over the place and muddled. And if I were defending them, I would say that's the advantage of a big tent. Republicans have not been all over the place on college campuses and free speech. It's been a remarkably nuance-lacking approach that suggests that a lot of people, from Mike Johnson all the way down, haven't read a pamphlet on freedom of speech, the role of academia, or the Middle East issue. Right? There's no nuance whatsoever. So by definition, the Democrats are the cleanest dirty shirt in the hamper at the moment on this issue. And this is what I remind people, that it's definitely unsatisfying. I think this, I have a banned book club. I interview banned authors every weekend. I have very strong views about freedom of expression and how we should deal with it. And I worry that in our industry, we've kind of wrecked some of it. So academia is all that's left. That doesn't mean that people should be burning things down on campuses and that there should be any instances of anti-Semitism. But it does mean we need a more nuanced and sophisticated approach to how campuses engender expression and protect the safety of their students and guarantee that there is no intellectual safety for them. I mean, I got 2 kids I put through university. I'm not interested in their intellectual safety on campus. I paid them to be intellectually unsafe. I paid for them to be intellectually unsafe. That's a very big discussion that's not going to happen between now and November, but the only place it could possibly happen in this world is with Democrats. Republicans have absented themselves from this discussion. There are a lot of old-fashioned Republicans who are conservatives, who have really strong views on the freedom of expression, but they're trying to steal their party back. They're trying to get their party back from the people who are burning it to the ground. So it's an interesting discussion. I would be intrigued that anybody would not vote for Democrats because of their being muddled, because the other side is not a good option if you feel strongly about the
One of the things I'll point out that when the president of Colombia resigned, you all saw that there were equal amounts of cheering from the protesters as from Elise Stefanik and Mike Johnson, because they both were unhappy with her.
Yes.
With her. Go ahead. Stephanie?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was going to add, basically, I don't anticipate Democrats really taking any stronger stance on this because it is such a political vulnerability for them. And I think, their strategy really would be to just focus on other topics that would mobilize young voters, like affordability, buying a house. One of the
student loan forgiveness.
Exactly, student loans. One of the reproductive rights as well. I think one of the best attack lines that Republicans have landed on Democrats is that young people can't reach the American dream anymore. And so if Kamala Harris can provide a policy that suggests that she will fix the housing crisis and the affordability crisis in this country, that they would be better off doing that.
Yeah, I feel like the only thing I will add about that is the reason it's been effective for Republicans is because it shows disarray and crime, right? Crime in major cities. That's what it shows. When you have a liberal, private university on fire in a major Democratic foothold city like New York, that really helps prove your point of like Democrats' city has gone wild, and it's what they've tried to do with the illegal immigration issue by busing immigrants to cities like Chicago and Boston and New York. I think that's where they've been able to do it. And I will also say, like, there's not much that a presidential candidate can do about a private university's decision on what they deem as anti-Semitic or not, right? So how much can Trump or her get involved? Or, I think one of the shocking things I saw was, like, my editor was like, do you want to go to Columbia? Like, Speaker Johnson is having it. And I'm like, why is Speaker Johnson going to Columbia? Like, I'm sorry, what are we doing here? Yeah. And it was just like this stunning, like, it was this whole idea that Republicans want small government, right? I can't think of a more big government thing than to go on a university steps when you're being booed. A private university when you're being booed and by protesters and tell them what they faculty should be doing with their students. So for me, I think like the reason they've been effective is because they've pointed it to crime and disarray in general in the Democratic Party. But I think if you look down on it, there's like Stephanie and Ali said, there's not really, the root is not Democrat.
Currency,
the root's not Democrat.
So one thing to think about, we're lots of journalists here, about the press strategy of Harris and Walz. There's a lot of complaints that they're not doing interviews. But one of the reasons you don't do interviews is then you're not pressed with answers that can be clipped and then played again and again.
Right, and if you're trending up the way they are at the moment, they don't have to. If they start trending down, they may have to reconsider that. But frankly,
but she will eventually.
Yeah, and then
she started. This was the start of it. You saw with Bash.
The one risk at that is that if you don't do enough interviews, if you fumble in one, then that becomes the moment.
Which is why she hasn't, because she fumbled in that one a year and a half ago, and she hasn't.
But remember, she was not a fantastic speaker, and she was a better debater, but she wasn't a fantastic speaker. She'd become a better speaker. So maybe she's become a better interview. We'll find out tonight.
We'd all love to know.
Yeah, we'd all love to know.
Journalists wouldn't actually I'm sorry, sorry for the follow-up question. But you said if she's trending up well, it's good for her politically speaking, not to do interview. But
I
as
wanted
journalists,
to do
shouldn't we be
interviews.
demanding that she does?
Oh, no,
journalists
we're
are
demanding.
demanding.
No, I'm just
They're
making, that was
shouting.
political commentary.
Don't worry, yeah,
that was
we're-
not journalistic commentary. That was political
we're
No,
commentary.
no. In fact, I have said multiple times she has to give interviews.
Yeah.
But if you were her advisor, you would tell
Yeah.
her not to do them.
Right.
That's
Yeah.
that's the difference. That's
Yeah.
the difference.
But she can't do that when she's president of the United
Yeah.
States.
Yeah.
Right.
Hey, I'm Tim and I work in tech. I was curious to know, so anecdotally, I know a good number of like Asian Americans who are like more open to Trump, I think, than the previous cycle. Like maybe the last election they voted for Biden, but now they're leaning toward Trump. These tend to be like Asians, Chinese Americans I know in like California and New York. I'm wondering if this is like reflected in the data and if there's any like trends that bind these people together. How are the motivations of these Asian Americans maybe different than non-Asian Americans or maybe similar?
So let's go to Stephanie, our polling expert here.
Oh gosh, what a title. The first thing I'll say about that, you don't need the Bloomberg reporter to tell you that this election is about the economy, right? And I think you can apply that generally speaking. It doesn't matter if you're Asian American. It doesn't matter what race you are. The economy is top of mind, and I think in particular the Chinese American community has been very focused on jobs, economy, healthcare, all those issues, and that tends to be where Republicans have a bright spot or are seen to have better messaging or better policies for. And I think that's something that definitely applies to the older generation. The other thing I would note is that it does seem like there are more people being willing to participate in this election. And so that growth you're seeing could just potentially be that there are more people enfranchised to vote this election cycle.
I mean, and you mentioned two of the most expensive places to live in America. So I'm sure, as someone who's lived in both places, it comes down to, at the end of the day, regardless of which identity you have, you want to be able to pay your bills. You want to pay less. Inflation is still, higher than most people have experienced in their lifetimes. And I think it all comes down to kitchen table issues.
There's also this old myth that hasn't gone away that Republicans are better for the economy than Democrats. It's not true in any measurable way. It's not true in GDP growth. It's not true in stock market performance. It's not true in unemployment. It's not true in job creation. It's not true in inflation. It's just not true. It's just never been true. You can parse it and say that split governments are better for the economy than a White House that controls Congress. But it is empirically true that Democrats are better for American economic performance than Republicans. Now, there are a couple of caveats to that. One is that in a couple of cases, it's been a Democrat who's taken over after a downswing.
Obama, Biden,
right,
yeah.
exactly, and or Bill Clinton.
Bill Clinton, yeah.
I also always make sure when I talk about the number of jobs created under Biden and the unemployment rate that it was at the end of COVID, right? So I kind of balance things out a little bit for Trump, even though he exacerbated COVID. But there is a myth. So as you get either older or a little more financially successful, or you start worrying about your tax rates, or you start moving into higher tax rates, there's a trend to become more economically conservative, and there is a prevailing myth that Republicans are better for that. It's not true, but not only does Donald Trump tout that, he touts the fact that he's actually the best person for everything that ever happened in the economy. Kamala Harris has a real job to do. She's actually got a very interesting economic policy that she put out in North Carolina about a week and a half ago. It's pretty sophisticated. The fact is, people who, and you guys will know this, when you're out in a crowd and you're talking to a bunch of Republicans who will say, what's your biggest issue? Economy. What's your biggest issue in the economy? Inflation. And then you ask them what inflation's been doing, and they'll tell you it's 10%. Or whatever the case is. There's a real messaging problem. And once people have decided what they think about the economy, it's very hard to move them. And 68 days may not be enough time to move them.
Democrats are horrible messengers.
Horrible message, always.
They could find peace in the Middle East. You would not know it. It's
Yes,
amazing.
they'll gloss over it. It'll be like a middle.
Yeah, it's amazing their ability
And
to
Republicans
bundle
are
up
great
their own.
messengers.
And Republicans are great messengers.
So one of the things that I think struck a lot of us was that number that Bill Clinton touted multiple times. He said he triple checked it, 50 million to 1.
Yeah.
And of course that's a net number, and it results in it's a result of also the wars and
Yes.
who came in right after
Yes, right.
and Obama coming in after. So all of that.
Right, it cheapens everything when you use sort of quick,
Yeah.
pithy numbers, but the economics are actually real.
The other thing I'll note on that is I think in the last couple of years on Capitol Hill in this presidential election, there has been sort of a shift in how we message about, U.S. competing with China. It often had seemed like for a long time Republicans were at the forefront of that issue. Now that we see more Democrats messaging on that, it does seem more of a bipartisan issue. But I do think that there could have the advantage, just
Trump's
given
nonsense on China is going to be the most disastrous thing to ever happen to America, right? His talk about a 10 or 20% tariff for everybody in the world, and then a 60%. First of all, I'm sure he knows what a tariff actually is, but he claims it's a tax on the country that's exporting the goods. It's only a tax on you. And a little bit of math to tell you how much we buy from China will make it very clear that, there's been great studies on this about what it'll cost the average family. That is actually imposed inflation. It's not the inflation that occurred because we had a supply chain problem during COVID. This is imposed inflation. But people can be unmoved by these things. Donald Trump's economic policies that he's unveiled are going to be disastrous. I don't think he'd go through with it. I don't think he's really going to impose a 60% China tariff on goods coming in from China. It's an impossibility. But it could help him win the election.
Right. I do think that some of his advisors say, he might not actually go through with this. This
It's
could just be a
ridiculous,
negotiation chip or a bargaining chip.
In the back here.
Hi, I'm James Pothin. I'm a journalist and a proud member of SAJA. Good to see you, Sree. I hope I'm not going a little bit outside of the assignment, but I was curious. It seems like post-2016, there was a wave of young people running for office, women running for office, people of color running for office. I live in New York, so I've seen more candidates who are Asian American of all types, particularly South Asian American. And I know Kamala Harris was the first South Asian American senator. I'm curious. I don't feel like I've seen a lot of, or I'm not hearing a lot about anything that's non-presidential in terms of Asian American candidates, or if that representation has increased at the state level, local level, national level. I'm curious if any of you could speak to that.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Andy Kim, obviously in New Jersey, going to likely be the next New Jersey senator. But in general, I think, what you saw in 2016 was a reaction to Trump, right? So the infiltration of the squad, who is now, much larger but also smaller than it was, is a reaction to Donald Trump, right? Democrats have had the White House for the last 3.5 years. So there isn't, any time that you are in control of the White House, there is less of a likelihood of this extreme backlash candidates that come in and, try to push their way in. And I think what you're seeing a lot, even with folks like AOC who came in on that wave in 2018, is, a moving to the center. It's not hospitable for you to be a Cori Bush or a Jamal Bowman anymore. It's also not hospitable for you to be the chairman of the House Freedom Caucus who lost his election, who lost his primary. So I think what you're seeing is both Republicans and Democrats are learning that the center is, first of all, where power is and where they could get voters, people who haven't voted or who are independent voters, but also how you govern. Everything that has passed in the last 3.5 years of Biden's term the majority has been bipartisan. They could not pass anything without each other's help. And I think you're seeing a return of that. Now, obviously, if Trump wins, we can talk again in 2026, and we can see what that looks like. You might see a lot of firsts in office, but I think right now, because of the Democratic president, there hasn't been that extreme of a backlash to him.
Really good analysis. Thank you. We're going to do rapid fire questions. We're starting to wrap up. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Alex Kenny. I'm a student at Rutgers University in New Jersey. I am also the head news editor of our campus newspaper. Because I know here and there are some mentions of the campus protests. That's something that I've been very entrenched in with my work. I guess specifically to give a little context for my campus, especially since our university president, Jonathan Holloway, testified before Congress back in May, the school has put out, and it's not the only one that's been doing this. I've seen this at a few other campuses as well, but free expression has kind of been more, more restricted on campus. For our campus, for example, that's resulted in encampment bans, and we have a free speech like a free expression notification requirement now.
That sounds like an oxymoron.
I'm about to give free speech.
Free speech alert.
Yeah, and that's kind of something that's going on at our campus. That's particularly very strongly South Asian and also very strongly Arab as well, very strongly Palestinian, particularly in, like around like North Jersey. But speaking with that compared to what we saw at the DNC, where freedom was very strongly emphasized, especially in the Harris-Walz campaign right now, do we think that freedom, or perhaps more specifically freedom of speech or academic freedom, is becoming more of a key issue to the Asian American electorate than it was previously?
I think I think we heard that this is not something they're going to focus on, right? That's going to be part of the.
They're dipping their toe into it because part of that freedom, you'll notice many of them mention book bans, right? So that's where I think the entry point is. If you think books shouldn't be banned, then you think speech shouldn't be banned. The complexity of this issue is that people have both deliberately and unintentionally muddled free expression and free speech with some really horrible stuff that's been going on as it relates to either anti-Semitism or Islamophobia. Those are really bad things, and one should assume that we should all be united in tackling those issues, both of which have been growing over the years in the entire Western world. And people are just not prepared to do the hard work of separating the fact that there are some people, including Arab Muslim students, including Jewish students, including students who belong to neither of those groups, who are progressives or just would like justice and not to be involved in some of the stuff going on. It's just more complicated than the idea of this is anti-Semites or these are Islamophobes. There are probably anti-Semites and Islamophobes on every campus, and schools need to figure out how to deal with that without curtailing free speech. They'll use the argument that this doesn't apply to us in the same way because they're private universities in some cases. That's not the point. The point is we need to understand what academic freedom looks like. We need to understand what role university campuses play in protecting speech, ideas, debate, and nurturing intellectual growth. We've decided to skip that, basically. It's my hope we'll go back to it in a sane and rational way to say, how do we keep your kids safe, physically safe? We are not going to keep them intellectually safe. And so everybody's been muddling through this one. It's not great. The Democrats are not going to lean into this for reasons that you cited. I don't know whether I think South Asians or Asian Americans are
Care about, yeah. I mean, I don't know if that's how they would describe it, but I think it would go down with the idea of freedom, right? To decide who you can marry, what books you can read. Right. All of that falls under that. I don't know if people have distinctly then like freedom of expression is under attack. I think Republicans have spent a lot of time with that argument in previous election cycles. But I think what's more interesting about, what's happening on college campuses is this idea that, it does go beyond, like, it is something that brings, like, Asian Americans together with Arab Americans, right? And few issues can able to, like, bridge those kinds of divides. But I think they're more focused, I think Democrats have learned to not spend a lot of time doing that. But I will say at the DNC, like, they gave all of the uncommitted delegates and all of their family members and other protesters passes to the arena, passes inside the security perimeter. Obviously, there was protests outside, but they genuinely, like, were not trying to hide the fact that these people were outwardly criticizing them a few hundred feet away from the vice president, away from her running mate. So, I mean, there is an effort to do that, but whether or not that will be like an election issue, I don't think so.
And freedom is also the freedom to be safe on campus and to be,
have an education.
To have an education and not be subject to anti-Semitism and not be subject to anti-Asian hate and not be subject to Islamophobia. So it's a complicated question that doesn't lend itself to the remaining 68 days of the campaign.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Ram. I'm a software engineer here, and I moved recently from San Francisco. And my question is, so in San Francisco a few years ago, a city with a very large Asian American population, there was a local election where an incumbent Asian American representative was voted out in favor of a more moderate non-Asian American representative within a very predominantly Asian American community. And so coming back to some of your points around identity politics, how the Republicans are very much trying to stay away from that, Democrats playing into it a little bit, I'm wondering in this election cycle where so much of local politics is going to be in the shadow of the national election, like what impact that could have on local elections? And like, I guess maybe more specifically, what do you see as like the line between like too little identity politics and too much, like because in terms of relating with the electorate?
Good question.
So what I'd like to do is take a couple of more questions and then have some final thoughts because we're wrapping up here. So anybody else have a question you'd like to throw in? Yeah. So thank you for that. We'll definitely answer it. So be ready, folks. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Amy. I actually work at AAJA Society, but I'm actually really curious if you guys have any thoughts on the ways, specifically how the Harris campaign can actually leverage Tim Walz's Asia experience, and do you think that would speak to the
Asia
electorate?
experience, yeah.
And sorry, what specific?
His time teaching in China.
Oh, okay,
and
got
his,
it.
Well,
I was like-
Republicans are calling it like they're somehow trying to hook him
Oh,
to being
yes, yes. I thought you
communist.
meant like he likes Asian food. I was like, what exact experience?
Yeah, his restaurant he was
his
at.
time teaching in
Yeah.
In Asia,
in
yeah.
southern China in the 80s and 90s, and then his subsequent trips back to China with his high school class.
Okay, so that's good. Let's do one
I can
more.
do the identity politics
Yeah,
one and then, yeah.
Last question we'll throw in here. Yeah, go ahead.
I just have a very simple question. I'm just a regular citizen, a nobody citizen.
Oh, you are. No such thing.
You know, you talk about freedom and freedom of speech. There has to be limits to that too.
No, they don't.
What do you mean by freedom of speech? And
The
what do you
ability to say
mean
what
by
you want and
freedom
have
of-
it debated.
Freedom of action, freedom of saying whatever you want. And the other issue that I am have a question in my mind is that we hear about all these pro-Palestinian protests, and they have a reason to do that. But we don't hear about the Jewish protests that much. They're not played in the journalism and in the newspapers and all. What's going on between all that? And why?
Well, I'll just say the largest Jewish protests are every Saturday in Tel Aviv, where hundreds of thousands of
For 2
Jewish
years now.
people
Yeah.
are coming out and protesting against.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
Yeah.
It's
against.
not in this country and not on campus.
There was a
No, but
huge one in
I
DC
agree.
a
Yeah.
few
It
weeks
should
ago.
not be part of a campus activity. Campus.
Well, I'm not sure. I'm not saying that. I don't believe that at all. I think protests should be a very big part of it. I'm a proud protester. I was arrested in university. I write about it in my book. I come from a family of protest. My family's involved in politics, and I'm a journalist because my grandfather was Mahatma Gandhi's youngest student. My family has spent a lot of years going to jail fighting injustice around the world, and that involves protests. So I am not anti-protest by any means,
But
by any
doesn't
stretch.
it take away
No, it doesn't.
from
That's your university.
intellectual activity
No, it doesn't. Because when
and
you
distracts
grow, no,
everybody?
it doesn't distract. It grows you. It exposes you to people who weren't in your high school. Because everybody in your high school came from your area. They probably share socioeconomic status, perhaps cultural status. You go to university and you are there with people from the world who you didn't even know, they were from a race you didn't even know existed. And that is more than money can buy. That's what we want. That's what I wanted my kids to do when they went to university. It hurts. It's painful. It's difficult. But it's not a distraction to your education. It's part of your education.
So it's
I think.
nothing new. Yeah, it's definitely nothing new. It has just been like, it's the most like quintessential American
Or
campus
really academic
experience. Yeah,
experience.
academic experience.
I hear your point, though. I get your point, that at some point, does a university have some obligation and ability to say, what role do we play in nurturing this, and what role do we play in ensuring that it doesn't become such that it does what you're saying, become an interference to your ability. So I agree. I think we're actually on the same side. I think universities have not done a good job of saying, how do we structure this so that there is an ability to have protest, there's an ability to disagree, there's an ability to learn how to debate with each other, and yet still also meet your requirements to pass your exams and get a degree. And that's where I think that's hard work. That's not an obvious. I think you're right. Yeah, so you know, but it worked. Right? College students during Vietnam actually worked. Oh yeah, it did.
Oh, it did.
Yeah,
Of course it
sure
did.
did. Yeah.
Of course it did.
Yeah.
All right, okay, folks,
yeah.
we're going to get the hook here. So here's what I'd like to do. I'd like our speakers to give us their final thoughts, but address the question of identity, how much identity, and then about Tim Walz and his Asia experience. And I also want to point out that one way in which this election is different, they're saying the first TikTok election, TikTok was barely there in 2020. It's also the first American WhatsApp election. And if you know Asian communities, they live on WhatsApp. And I don't think the mainstream outreach is on that, but within the groups, subgroups, they're definitely using WhatsApp to reach the uncles, the aunties, all of those folks. So if you can touch upon any or all of those in 60 seconds each, will be great.
Cool.
Thank you, Stephanie.
I was going to say, I do think that the line often is drawn at violence. You know, we hear politicians say all the time, we denounce any form of violence when it comes to these protests. You know, we've seen an increase in violence against politicians in the last couple of years, and so it is a real concern among a lot of people in DC. On the point about down ballot races and local races, you know, if these candidates can mobilize more folks to come out, they could obviously sway certain races. And I think especially in Florida, where largely Democrats had written off the state when it came to the presidential, the state chair is very, very narrowly focused on winning local school board elections. And so I think that's something we'll see across the country. And it tends to, I think Asian American voters also seem to be more excited about these down ballot and local races more so than the presidential. At least some polling suggests that.
And China, the Walz-China connection.
Oh, I don't think I have much to say about that. The Republican Party has been very vocal about that and trying to tie him to, you know, communist China. Trump often says that Kamala Harris is a Marxist, and so I'm not entirely sure what the Democratic Party is doing, but that's what Republicans are.
When I mentioned TikTok, one of the things was, one of my favorite clips this year is of the CEO of TikTok talking into Stefanik and others who they keep saying, are you Tom Cotton, who says, are you ever been a member of the Communist Party? Are you a citizen of China? He says, sir, I'm from Singapore. Sir, I'm from Singapore. I'm a citizen of Singapore. I'm a citizen.
Yeah.
And that's racism right there in a really unusual way.
And sorry, to the last point about WhatsApp channels, one thing that the Democratic Party has been doing is starting affinity groups. So they've got a couple rolling out, and this is largely targeting, you know, WhatsApp groups and going directly to community grassroots organizations. And I think that could play a significant role when it comes to turning out people to vote in November.
You know, folks, let's thank Stephanie Lai. Please follow her on Twitter and follow all the great reporting that she's doing from the field. Thank you. She had to take sort of a day off to be here because she wanted to come to Asia Society. So we're very grateful to you, Stephanie. Thank you. She lives in D.C. Ali Velshi?
I don't have much to add to my two colleagues up here who are fantastic. I will point out one thing. There's one issue about identity politics, that while Republicans have sort of asked each other, Republican leaders have asked their members not to engage in stuff having to do with Harris's background or gender. I'm not going to ask you to read Project 2025 because it's a terrible read, but I have read it. It's 922 pages. It is one big identity politics document. It is about Christian white nationalism, and they say it. It's written in there. It's not hidden. They're talking about a Christian perspective on what the world is going to look like and what it needs to do. And the white nationalist perspective is when you look at what they're doing in terms of national security, where they're literally redirecting the FBI from certain types of investigations, particularly they sort of, like they talk about wokeism, they talk about an obsession with white national violence in America. That's the biggest kind of terrorist violence there absolutely is by a long shot. Like, you can redirect people to Al-Qaeda all you want, but that's not where the action is at the moment. So it's just important to remember that they might be getting more sophisticated about what you shouldn't say on the mics about other people in their race, but they are running on a document that is based on white Christian nationalism, and that's as identity politics as it gets.
Yeah.
Ali Velshi, ladies and gentlemen. Get his book, Small Acts of Courage. Thank you. Ali's going to be on TV tonight, tomorrow, Saturday, Sunday. He works 7 days a week. And Ali will be speaking at the SAJA 30th Anniversary Conference coming up October 11th and 12th. So please come back. If you didn't get enough Velshi every day, you can get more of him there. Right. So please join us for that. Now, over to you. Your thoughts.
Yeah, I don't know how I can follow that. But I will talk about TikTok because I'm a recent survivor of TikTok. I had to delete it off my phone because I felt myself becoming very stupid. But But it is just, and I had to explain what TikTok was to my colleagues at AAPI so many times and how powerful it is and how important it is. And I will note it is going to be banned in the US in a few weeks in October. It has, unless it's divested from ByteDance, which there is no news that it has been. So I think the timing of that will be stunning, right? You're going to find a huge group of young people who are already pissed about Gaza, who are already pissed about costs, the fact that they didn't get their student loans extended, and then you're going to take away one of the most powerful tools that they are using to not only build businesses for themselves, but to find pockets of the world where they belong. So I am always, and entertainment, yeah. Like for me, it was like makeup tutorials, which is great, and you need that. But I think we can't underestimate how much Kamala Harris's rise is due to her ability, her laughing on TikTok, her saying things about coconuts on TikTok. Like that is the reason that when Biden stepped down and she stepped up, there wasn't this learning curve that there would have been with any other candidate. And the reason why Tim Walz was chosen, I'm not a Democratic strategist, but he was very popular on TikTok, and him talking about his daughter and talking about using IUI to be able to him and his wife to have a kid, like all of these were very prominent on that app, and I think that Republicans or Democrats would underestimate the power of it if they don't utilize it correctly.
Farnoush.
And I don't work for TikTok.
In fact, you deleted it from your
I deleted
app.
it, but I love it.
It's the most interesting endorsement / like I hate it.
Don't get it, but it's great.
Folks, we're right on time here. We're going to leave, but I want you to, we'll have the folks step out. You can say hello and get selfies with everybody. I will say to all of you, please come back to all the fabulous fall programming at AAJA Society, especially the JLF New York. Coming here on September 10th, so please come to that. And please thank our friends, especially John Huang, who worked so hard to put this together in the back. Thank you, John.
Thanks, John.
And to the entire team here, thank you very, very much, everybody.